go back. I'm a predominantly B9 grower. We have a few B10s on Honeycrisp now that I'll comment on later. But just to go back to our history of B9s, and we selected that rootstock back in the mid 90s for multiple reasons, but primarily it was the only one that was commercially available at that point for us to order liners that we thought would be fire blight resistant in the orchard. And that proved to be the case. We were planting Galas and Fujis and a lot of other things, and we wanted to pick one rootstock to simplify things. It just so happened that that was the one we could get for fire blight resistance. And it seemed to work well for us on all varieties. A lot of them are considerably more vigorous than Honeycrisp, obviously. But that we learned to adapt along the way how to overcome the lack of vigor in Honeycrisp, primarily in the nursery, in our own nursery. And that we got into the mode of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So while we've been very successful with B9 and it has the traits that you'd like in terms of very low benefit levels, it is difficult to fill the space, and especially in a timely manner. You can always do it over time, but obviously that costs you money. So this 2 to 3 to 4 year period, we decided to do some of that tree growth in the nursery by holding the trees another year and trying to plant a tree that was close to 8 feet tall. No branches, but we manipulated it in the nursery to do that, push a grow through tree, and not necessarily plant a designer rootstock, which I think is a great idea, but to plant a designer tree for our system that had height and not width and very little management in the first year or two. So we combated its most serious issues within the nursery, I would say, and can now fill our space much quicker than we used to, and is still enjoying the benefits of a relatively weak tree, but the one that will fill its canopy space. And I'm very big on this realistic approach to assessing your canopy. If you don't have 100% canopy, don't ever commit to having 100% of a crop. If you aren't realistic about that, you don't know how to manage it from there. So if you plant B9 and can only ever get 60 or 70% of a canopy, either because of tree spacing or tree vigor, then you're locked into that 60 or 70% of what is its potential on that system. So yeah, there are lots of weak points in there. It's always proven difficult to us. And I would say we have M9s, 337s mainly in our earliest super spindle blocks, but they prove to be too vigorous over time, too difficult to manage. It's not that you can't manage them, it's just that it's a lot more work, and getting to the right quality of fruit becomes harder. So we are quite in favor of a lower vigor tree such as a B9 in our system, in the climate that we have, in the growthy soils that we have, to be able to make that work. Now, does that mean I should ignore 214? Absolutely not. I mean, we're remiss if we don't do that. Given our system of growing our own trees, I don't even know if we can buy 100,000 214 liners for our nursery. I may be wrong, I haven't tried, but that was one of the big holdups with Geneva early on, is we couldn't get volumes from the nurserymen. They had all those trees sold for us to be able to plant liners in nurseries. I'd like to think that's changing, but that was one of the hang-ups with our move in towards Geneva and different rootstocks. So anyway, that's just a little bit, part of our thought process and how we manage weaknesses. But in any system you do, that's what you're going to have to do. So, but really consider Terrence's early numbers there. That's a considerable amount of money.
I think we started planting Budagowski 9 on Galas in the early 90s, and we liked what we've seen with the Gala. And then in 2007, I think we planted our first block of Honeycrisp on Bud 9. And a lot of the decisions that we have, I have many conversations with my managers. And one thing that they always recognize with Bud 9 is that there's very little pruning. And we always have plenty to hand thin in that variety every year, whether it's Gala or Honeycrisp. And it definitely is very precocious. We had a couple blocks planted in 2007, and 90% of it was Bud 9. we had about 3.5 rows of 337, and we couldn't get the tree to settle down. That was a 12x3. We couldn't get the tree to bear, and we always had bear pit issues. So we actually ended up taking out those rows, and that discussion that conversation was made with the managers and myself. And Terrence, excellent presentation, and I liked your information, and very good information, Rod and Tom. So today, when we go to plant a bud 9, we almost try and figure out what site we're going to be putting those trees on. Is it a replant? Is it a site that's never seen trees? How are we going to match that spacing to the Budogowski 9, that Honeycrisp? And so we've gotten down to that 10x2, which seems to be a pretty good spacing. And it's very expensive for sure, because the cost of nursery trees has gone up substantially. So if we want to do that in the future, we're probably going to have to look at trying to grow our own trees. But we still, it's a very precocious rootstock. We've seen very low vigor. We have to be very, very aggressive as we plant that tree and put that tree in the ground. We do a lot of extra things for Budogowski 9, and we think the upfront money is a pretty good payoff in return. Again, it's very, once we fill the space, it's easy to manage. We just have to be very careful, and we have to stick to the basics. We have to do everything right. There's no doubt about it. We have to push the tree, the first, second leaf and third leaf. We have to make sure we get a good trellis system designed. We got to make sure we constantly make sure the leaders are tied up, and we want consistency. We even got into mounding some trees. We see a little bit more consistency with mounding. We try and keep that grafting out of the ground, and be as consistent as possible. And so we tend to have a little bit less vigor in the bud 9, and a little bit more penetration for sun, and it just seems like a rootstock to work very well. Another thing that we've seen with bud 9 on some other varieties is we've gotten into 3 out of 5 years where we get temperatures as low as 25 below, and we're not losing any trees whatsoever on other varieties on bud 9, where you take like Fuji, that's very sensitive to very cold winters, and if you look at 337 or Nick 29, we've lost a lot of trees. And on Budogowski 9, we haven't lost one tree for winter injury issues. So that's kind of why we like bud 9. It's been a rootstock that we've been comfortable with for quite a few years. It's hard to change rootstocks every year, if you will. It definitely was a rootstock that I was exposed to. One of the IFTAs, early 90s, I believe it was in the state of Washington, and you just could see how precocious that rootstock was compared to 337 or Nick 29 at the time. So,
thank you, Chris. Bruce, you are probably the only one that doesn't have the M9s, at least in the video in the orchard that you share. Can you talk a little bit and briefly why you make that decision? You did mention something in the video. Why you have the M9s?
We probably have in commercial quantities almost every rootstock that was on Terrence's list, with the exception of some of the newer Cornell releases, and that was because of availability. I mean, we've planted a lot of Honeycrisp, and quite seriously, a lot of them was the rootstock selection was not the issue, it was availability. Now, obviously, we didn't mix rootstocks in a given block, but we've got bud 9s, we have G30s, we have 210s, we do have some M9 337s. We have bud 118. We have Honeycrisp on M26, grafted on M7, grafted on 106. And I would make just a couple of comments, probably 4 comments. First, I thought Terrence's point about it's not yield, it's marketable yield is the real driver, the real measure of the economic efficiency of a block. And that is spot on. But I would want everybody to take into consideration Terrence's data focused on the reduction in yield related to bitter pit. But in a given situation, Chris just commented about the cold hardiness of Bud 9. Well, if you have a block of M9337 and it's in its second or third leaf, and it got hit with a winter freeze event, that is a much more significant negative influence than slightly lower yields or slightly higher incidence of bitter pit expression. Fire blight. Honeycrisp is not necessarily the most sensitive fire blight strain, but or variety, but it is receptive to fire blight. And if you get the fire blight into your rootstock, obviously that can have a huge impact on the yield levels of the block and how quickly you attain it. I've used a lot of the data from the Washington State trials, and a lot of the Washington State trials, if you simply were looking at yield as the key indicator, a more vigorous rootstock with a reasonably good level of precocity would lead you to plant the more vigorous rootstock and fight the vigor battle. We have done that. We don't have a lot of G30s, but we have some. But I will make this comment about G30s in Washington State. It is, we always fill the canopy and we fill it very quickly. We always have a high number of fruit. We have a lot of bitter pit in our G30, the small amount of G30s we have. Actually, one of our best blocks, probably our best block, is a Bud 9 block that was planted in the about probably 17, 18 years ago. It was a 2x13 V system, but we filled the canopy by the end of the fourth leaf, and it consistently produces 80 plus bins. Is generally pretty acceptable if you manage your fruit size.